In the spring of 2018, somewhere in the middle of the country, a man opened his garage and reached for a Revell box he'd been saving since 1967. He didn't know why he'd kept it, he just had. Inside a 125 scale 57 Chevy, every sprue still connected. Instructions folded exactly as they'd come from the factory. He'd been reading the news that week. He knew what had happened in Illinois. For 75 years, Revell had been the name on the box, the name every American boy knew before he knew what a corporation was. The plastic smell, the X-Acto knife, the tube of tester's glue. Saturday afternoon on a card table in the basement. And then in a single spring it was over. What killed a company that had once been in the hands of nearly every American child, and who decided the name was worth keeping even after they let everything else go? Louis Glazer did not set out to build an empire. In 1943, he was a young entrepreneur in Venice, California, working with injection-molded plastic at a moment when the material itself was still new enough to feel like the future. The war had made plastic indispensable ammunition casings, aircraft components, instrument panels. American factories had learned to work with it at speed and scale. When the war ended, all that manufacturing knowledge had nowhere to go. Glazer had an idea. His company Revell started by making novelty items, doll furniture, small decorative pieces, the kind of product you sold in 5 and dime stores and forgot about by Tuesday. It was a business, but barely. What changed everything was not a plan, it was a prototype. In 1951, Revell released a 1/16 scale plastic model of the Convair B-36 bomber, a massive 8-engine aircraft that was at that moment the backbone of American strategic air power. The kit was accurate, detailed, challenging in exactly the right way, and it sold. Not slowly, not cautiously. It sold the way things sell when they arrive at precisely the right moment in history. America in 1951 was the country obsessed with flight power and the particular kind of optimism that comes from having just won the most consequential war in human history. Men who had built things during the war, riveted aircraft panels, assembled engines, fit electrical harnesses inside bomber fuselages, came home wanting to keep building. Their sons grew up watching them. The B-36 kit landed in that world like a signal flare. Hobby shops that had carried balsa wood and paint suddenly had a new product moving off the shelves faster than they could restock it. Mail-order catalogs added Revell kits within months. Schools started stocking them. Boys who had never built anything more complex than a birdhouse were suddenly sitting at kitchen tables, squinting at instruction sheets, learning to dry-fit parts before gluing. Glazer watched the numbers and moved fast. Within 4 years, Revell had signed licensing agreements with every major American automaker. Detroit was in its chrome-era tail fins, two-tone paint V8 engines that felt like a national statement. Ford, Chevrolet, Chrysler all understood that a scale replica of their newest model sitting on a boy's shelf was advertising of a different order. Glazer understood it too. The result was Revell's Trophy Series, 125 scale car kits that captured the exact proportions, panel lines, and trim details of the real vehicles rolling off assembly lines in Michigan. A boy in Alabama could hold a Revell 57 Chevy Bel Air and feel the fins under his thumb. A kid in Ohio could build a Ford Thunderbird before his father could afford one. The kits were not toys. They were a form of desire made physical, the closest thing a 12-year-old could get to the thing he wanted most. By the mid-1950s, Revell had outgrown its original Venice facility. New tooling, new dies, more product lines, aircraft, ships, military vehicles, science fiction subjects pulled from the new television programs that were rearranging American leisure. Glazer kept adding. The catalog thickened. The distribution network spread east, then overseas. Within a decade of that first B-36 kit, Revell was the largest model kit manufacturer in the world. It was the kind of growth story that looked inevitable in retrospect. At the time, it required constant decisions about licensing, about scale, about which subjects a 12-year-old in 1957 would spend 3 weeks of allowance money to build. Glazer made those decisions well, and for a long time, he made them right. The Venice factory hummed. The orders came in. The kits went out. For a long time, that was enough. More than enough. By 1960, you could find a Revell kit in almost any town in America that had a drugstore. Not a hobby shop, not a specialty retailer, a drugstore, a 5 and dime, a hardware store with a spinning wire rack near the register. Revell had cracked the distribution problem that defeated most of its competitors. The kits were cheap enough to be an impulse purchase, complex enough to occupy a boy for a full weekend, and satisfying enough that he'd want another one before the glue on the first had fully cured. The price point mattered. A Revell kit in 1960 cost between 50 cents and $2. That was within range of a boy's allowance, within range of a birthday gift, within range of what a father might pick up on a Friday afternoon without thinking twice about it. The cardboard box was part of the pitch. Revell's box art was painted by professional illustrators, dramatic angles, dynamic lighting, the subject rendered with a kind of heroic precision that made the actual kit feel like it contained something more than plastic. boys didn't just want to build the kit, they wanted to own the box. Inside a Revell factory in the early 1960s, the operation ran on 3 shifts. Injection molding machines the size of automobiles worked continuously, forcing molten polystyrene into steel dies under thousands of pounds of pressure. Each cycle took seconds. Each cycle produced a sprue, a flat plastic tree with parts branching off at precise intervals, every piece numbered to match the instruction sheet. The machines ran hot. The floor ran loud. The smell of warm plastic hung in the air like a permanent weather system. Men worked the presses in 12-hour rotations, monitoring temperatures, pulling sprues, watching for flash, the thin plastic film that crept between die halves when tolerances drifted. Quality control meant holding a part up to a fluorescent light and knowing by sight whether it would fit. The men who did this well were skilled in a way that didn't look like skill from the outside. It looked like standing and watching. It was actually years of accumulated pattern recognition stored in the hands and the eyes. The tooling itself, the steel dies that shaped every part, represented enormous capital investment. A single die for a complex kit could take months to machine and cost as much as a modest house. Revell's competitive advantage was not just its catalog or its licensing agreements. It was its tooling library. Every die was an asset that could run for decades, producing the same parts year after year, generating revenue long after the initial investment had been recovered. At peak production, Revell's catalog included aircraft from both World War's Korean War subjects, contemporary jets, naval vessels from the Revolution through World War II, automobiles across every decade of the American century, science fiction ships pulled from television serials, and figure kits that let a boy build a Mercury astronaut or a Roman gladiator with equal commitment. There was something for every kind of boy, the one who loved speed, the one who loved history, the one who wanted the future. The cultural reach was difficult to overstate. In American households across the 1950s and 1960s, the hobby bench was a rite of passage. Fathers who had built models in the 1940s watched their sons build them in the 1960s. The smell of testers, glue, and enamel paint became sensory memory encoded across an entire generation. The particular Saturday afternoon feeling of a card table in a basement, a desk lamp pulled close, a transistor radio playing in the background, and a box of parts slowly becoming something recognizable. A man named Ray, or someone exactly like Ray, in 1,000 different towns might have built his first Revell kit at age 9, a P-51 Mustang his uncle brought back from Korea in a box with a bent corner. He built it wrong the first time. Wings misaligned, canopy fogged with glue. He built it again. By 12, he was painting in sub-assemblies. By 14, he was mastering decals. The kits taught patience without ever calling it that. They taught the relationship between following instructions and producing something real. That boy grew up. He forgot about the kits for a while, girls' cars, work life. But the smell of the glue years later could bring it back in a second. Revell understood this, even if it never said so directly. The kits were not just a product. They were a ritual. And for 15 years, Revell owned that ritual completely. None of them knew the factory had already begun dying. The trouble with being the dominant company in a market is that you start believing dominance is permanent. By the mid-1960s, Revell's leadership had watched the model kit industry plateau. The catalog was deep. The distribution was wide. The brand was as close to a household name as a hobby company could get. But growth, the kind that satisfied shareholders and justified expansion, required something new, something bigger, something that could double the business instead of adding 5% per year. In 1964, slot cars arrived. Not quietly. Slot cars arrived the way crazes arrive in America, suddenly, completely, and with the particular intensity of something that feels like it will last forever. The concept was simple miniature electric cars guided by a pin running in a slot cut into a plastic track, racing at speeds that looked genuinely fast at 1/32 scale. You could race a friend, you could time-lapse, you could upgrade motors, swap bodies, tune the chassis. It combined the building appeal of model kits with the competitive appeal of racing, and it hit American boys like a voltage surge. Hobby shops that had been quietly profitable for decades suddenly had lines out the door. Department stores built slot car displays the size of small rooms. Commercial slot car raceway businesses opened in storefronts across the country. You paid by the hour to run your car on a banked 8-lane oval while the place smelled of ozone and hot motor windings. It was for approximately 4 years the fastest growing segment of the American toy and hobby market. Revell saw the numbers and made the call. The company invested heavily, tooling for cars, tooling for track systems, tooling for accessories. They hired engineers, they built inventory. They positioned Revell slot cars as the premium product in the segment, the same way Revell kits had been positioned as the serious choice for the serious builder. The logic was sound. The execution was committed. The timing was catastrophic. The slot car boom peaked somewhere around 1966 and collapsed almost immediately after. The reasons were not complicated. The market had been flooded not just by Revell but by every major toy and hobby manufacturer in the country, all of whom had seen the same numbers and made the same calculation. Aurora, Tyco, Lionel, Marks. Everyone was making track and cars. The retail shelves filled beyond capacity. Prices dropped, margins evaporated. The commercial raceways which had opened by the hundreds began closing just as fast. Boys who had spent their allowances on slot cars moved on to mini-bikes to go-karts to whatever arrived next. Revell was left holding inventory it couldn't move and tooling it couldn't amortize. The losses were reported as significant. Hobbyist accounts from the period suggest the slot car venture pushed Revell to the edge of financial viability. The Venice operation absorbed the damage. Investment that might have gone into new kit tooling had gone into slot car dies instead. Product lines that could have refreshed the catalog were deferred. The company that had been the largest model kit manufacturer in the world was now managing a wound it hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully explain to the men on the floor who had nothing to do with the decision. Louis Glazer had built Revell on judgment, on knowing what a boy wanted before the boy knew it himself. The slot car gamble was a different kind of decision. It was reactive, it was driven by market data rather than product instinct. And it failed the way reactive decisions often fail, not because the data was wrong, but because by the time the data said go, the moment had already passed. The factory kept running, the kits kept shipping, the brand was strong enough to absorb a serious blow and still keep the lights on. But something had shifted in the accounting department that hadn't yet reached the floor, a recalculation of what Revell actually was and what it was worth to people who had never smelled the warm plastic or held a sprue up to the light. In 1972, Louis Glazer died. He had built this company from a novelty item operation in post-war California into the dominant hobby brand of the American century. He had made the decisions that mattered and one that didn't. He left behind a catalog, a tooling library, a brand name, and a company that was now for the first time without the man who had known what it was for. The real problem had not announced itself yet, but it was already inside the building. When a founder dies, a company does not grieve, it reorganizes. The men on the floor kept showing up. The presses kept running. The kits kept moving through distribution. From the outside, Revell in the mid-1970s looked like what it had always been, a catalog company with deep roots and a loyal customer base. From the inside, the people who understood the business knew something quieter and more corrosive was happening. The decisions were no longer being made by someone who had spent 20 years learning which subjects moved and which ones sat. They were being made by people who looked at Revell and saw a balance sheet. The first sale came in 1978. Mattel, the largest toy company in the world, the company that had turned Barbie into a global brand and Hot Wheels into a cultural institution, acquired Revell. The logic as articulated to the hobby press was synergy. Mattel had distribution. Revell had product. Together they would reach more of the market than either could alone. What Mattel actually had was a corporate structure that measured everything against its flagship brands. Revell's margins were real but modest. The kit business required patient investment tooling that took years to amortize, licensing relationships that needed tending product development cycles measured in seasons rather than quarters. Mattel operated on different timelines. The hobby division was never going to be Barbie. It was never going to generate the numbers that justified its position in a portfolio that size. By the mid-1980s, Revell was available again. In 1986, Odyssey Partners, a Wall Street firm, acquired Revell and immediately merged it with Monogram Models, the Chicago area manufacturer that had been Revell's most significant American competitor for 3 decades. The combined entity was called Revell Monogram. On paper, it was a consolidation of the 2 strongest names in American model kits, a combined catalog of several thousand subjects, a tooling library that represented the accumulated investment of 2 companies across 40 years. In practice, it was the beginning of a managed liquidation that would take another 30 years to complete. Odyssey Partners was not a hobby company. It was not interested in what a boy felt when he opened a box on a Saturday morning. It was interested in extracting value from assets, and Revell Monogram's assets were its brand names, its tooling, and its distribution relationships. The strategy was to consolidate operations, reduce costs, and position the combined company for another sale. Workers at the Monogram facility in Morton Grove, Illinois felt the change within months. Lines that had run on 3 shifts moved to 2. Product development slowed. The catalog, which had grown for decades, stopped growing. The men who had spent careers learning the particular demands of injection-molded plastic, the metallurgy of the dyes, the chemistry of the styrene, the tolerance windows that separated a clean part from a defective one, watched the decisions come down from people who had never held a sprue. Overtime dried up. The parking lot, which had been full before sunrise for as long as anyone could remember, started showing gaps by mid-morning. And then the ownership changed again. Hallmark Cards acquired Revell Monogram in 1994. Then came additional transactions, each one a different configuration of the same fundamental dynamic, financial owners extracting value from a brand whose underlying identity was eroding with every year that passed without genuine product investment. New tooling, the lifeblood of a kit company, the only way to keep the catalog fresh and relevant, became increasingly rare. The company was running on the accumulated investment of Louis Glazer's era on dies that were decades old on subjects that had been in the catalog since the Kennedy administration. The hobby market was changing around them. Japanese manufacturers, Tamiya most visibly, but also Hasegawa and Fujimi, were releasing kits with engineering precision that made comparable American products look dated. The fit was tighter. The detail was finer. The instructions were clearer. American hobbyists who had grown up on Revell were now in significant numbers, reaching past the familiar red and white box for something from Japan. The boys who had built their first Revell kits in 1960 were in their 40s now. Some of them were still building, but their sons were not necessarily following. The card table in the basement, the Saturday afternoon with the tube of glue and the transistor radio, that particular ritual was not replicating itself cleanly into the next generation. Video games had arrived, computers had arrived. The specific patience required to build a scale model, the willingness to spend 3 weekends on a single subject was no longer a default setting for American boys the way it had been in 1960. In 2007, what remained of Revell Monogram was acquired by Hobbico, an Illinois-based hobby conglomerate. The brand now sat inside a larger portfolio alongside other acquired names, each one a former independent company, each one reduced to a label on a product line managed for margin rather than mission. The kits still shipped. The Revell name was still on the boxes. In hobby shops that still existed in the shrinking aisle of department stores that still carried model kits, the red and white packaging looked more or less as it always had. But the tooling was aging. The catalog had stopped reflecting anything about the current moment. And somewhere in a corporate office in Illinois, a set of numbers was trending in one direction only. By the end of that year, the only question left was when, not if. Hobbico filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in January 2018. Not Chapter 11, reorganization. The version that implies a plan, a future, a restructured company emerging from the process with new terms and old purpose. Chapter 7. Liquidation. The legal designation that says there is nothing left to reorganize. The assets will be inventoried, appraised, and sold to whoever makes an offer. The employees will be notified. The doors will close. For the men and women who had spent careers inside the Revell operation, some of them the children of people who had worked there before them, the bankruptcy filing was not entirely a surprise. The signals had been accumulating for years. Reduced headcount. Product lines quietly discontinued without announcement. The particular silence that settles over a workplace when management stops talking about the future and starts talking only about the present quarter. But knowing something is coming does not prepare you for the morning it arrives. In the weeks following the bankruptcy filing, the operational reality became clear. Hobbico's assets would be sold. Revell's American business, the distribution network, the remaining domestic inventory, the customer relationships built across 7 decades would not survive the process as a going concern. The Revell that Louis Glazer had built in Venice, California in 1943, that had grown into the largest model kit company in the world, that had put a plastic B-36 bomber into the hands of the first post-war generation of American boys and never fully stopped, that Revell was ending. The physical closure came in April 2018. It did not come with the ceremony. There was no final shift whistle, no gathered workers, no speech from a plant manager about what the years had meant. The nature of a liquidation bankruptcy is administrative creditors' trustees' asset schedules. The human dimension gets processed alongside the equipment appraisals and the lease terminations. Workers received notification through the mechanisms that corporate law requires. Some had already found other employment, some had not. What the final days looked like inside the facility, hobbyist accounts suggest, was the particular atmosphere of an ending that everyone understands but nobody says out loud. Boxes being packed, files being pulled, the equipment that had produced millions of kits across decades being tagged for appraisal. Men who had spent 30 years running the same machines standing near them one last time, not because there was anything left to do, but because the machines were familiar in a way that the next thing, whatever it would be, was not going to be. Outside the world was not paying much attention. A hobby company closing is not the kind of news that stops traffic. The financial press covered the Hobbico bankruptcy in the context of the broader hobby industry consolidation competition from digital entertainment, the long decline of brick-and-mortar retail. The model kit community noticed immediately. Forums that had been running since the early days of the internet, places where collectors cataloged production runs, debated kit accuracy, tracked tooling histories across 50 years of manufacturer changes, filled with the particular combination of grief and anger that communities produce when something irreplaceable ends. Men who were 60 years old in 2018 had built their first Revell kit in 1966. They had never entirely stopped. The hobby had carried them through adolescence and early adulthood, and middle age had been the thing they did in the garage on winter evenings, had become the shared activity they tried to pass to their own children with mixed results. The forums were not just discussing a bankruptcy, they were processing something personal. A man in Ohio posted a photograph of his workbench. On it, a half-finished Revell B-17 Flying Fortress, the same subject Revell had been releasing in various forms since the 1950s. He had started it the week the bankruptcy was announced. He wrote one sentence beneath the photograph, building it anyway. Hundreds of people responded. What the bankruptcy did not destroy, what bankruptcy cannot touch, was the tooling. The steel dies that had been producing Revell parts for decades were physical assets appraised and scheduled for sale like everything else. Some of the tooling had already migrated to manufacturing facilities in China over the preceding decade, transferred as part of cost reduction initiatives by previous owners. Some remained in domestic storage. The fate of individual dies, which subjects survived, which were lost, which ended up in the hands of a German company that had been operating independently under the Revell name since the post-war licensing era, became in the months that followed one of the central preoccupations of the collector community. Revell GmbH, the German entity, had existed since the 1950s as a separately operated licensee. It had its own tooling, its own product development, its own relationship with European hobbyists. When the American Revell collapsed, the German company was positioned to acquire the brand name and portions of the American catalog, which they did in 2019. The name survived. The red and white box survived. Some of the tooling survived. But the American Revell, the company Louis Glaser built, the company that had run on the labor and knowledge of American workers for 75 years, the company whose kits had taught a generation of boys the particular satisfaction of making something with their hands, that company did not survive. The gates did not close with a ceremony. They closed with a bankruptcy filing and an April morning. The Revell boxes still exist. You can order them online today. The red and white packaging, the familiar logo, the instruction sheet folded in the same format it has used for decades. If you didn't know the history, you might not notice anything had changed. The name is the same, the scale designations are the same, some of the subjects are the same tooling running in a different country under different ownership, producing the same sprue trees that Louis Glaser's engineers designed half a century ago. But the boy in Ohio who built his first Revell kit in a basement in 1966 knows. He can't always articulate what he knows, but he feels it when he opens the box. Something in the tolerances. Something in the way the instructions are written, something absent that used to be present, the way a room feels different after someone has moved out even before you've identified what's missing. The Venice, California that Glaser started in is unrecognizable now. The post-war industrial neighborhood where injection molding machines ran hot through the night has been absorbed into a different version of Los Angeles creative economy real estate premium, the particular transformation that happens when manufacturing leaves and something else arrives that pays more per square foot. There is no marker. No historical designation. The building, if it still stands at all, holds no visible trace of what was made there. The Morton Grove, Illinois facility that became the heart of Revell monogram operations after the 1986 merger sits in a suburb that absorbed its factory closures the way Midwestern towns absorb most things quietly, practically without much public ceremony. The workers who ran those lines are in their 60s and 70s now. Some found comparable work. Many did not. The skill set that made a man valuable on an injection molding floor in 1985 did not transfer cleanly to the economy that replaced it. The tooling, those steel dies that represent the accumulated capital investment of 75 years of American kit manufacturing, is scattered now across facilities in Germany and China managed by a Spanish company that acquired Revell GmbH in 2023. The dies still run. The parts still come off the sprues with the same geometry they had when American workers first pulled them from the machines. The tooling outlasted the company that made it. It will outlast several more owners before it finally wears out. In the collector community, the pre-2018 American Revell kits are cataloged with the precision of archivists. Forum threads document which subjects exist in which production runs, which decal sheets correspond to which manufacturing era, which tooling revisions distinguish a 1968 release from a 1978 re-release. Men who spent their careers in other fields, accounting, engineering, education, apply extraordinary rigor to the documentation of a plastic kit catalog. It is not nostalgia for its own sake. It is the preservation of a record that no corporation is keeping. In 2023, Ammo by Mig Jimenez, a Spanish modeling supplies company founded by a former scale modeler, completed the acquisition of Revell GmbH. The new owners announced investment in tooling commitment to the hobby plans for the catalog. Whether those plans represent genuine resurrection or another iteration of the same long management cycle is a question the collector community is watching with the particular patience of people who have seen this before. The name is still on the box. That is not nothing. A name carries memory. A name carries the accumulated association of every basement workbench, every Saturday afternoon, every boy who learned from a Revell instruction sheet that following a sequence carefully one step at a time produced something real. But the man who understood what the name meant is 75 years gone. And the company he built, the American one, the one that smelled like warm plastic and ran on 3 shifts, closed on an April morning in Illinois with no ceremony and no final words. Somewhere tonight, a man in his 60s is at his workbench. The lamp is on. The radio is low. There is a Revell box open in front of him, an old one found at an estate sale, the cardboard soft at the corners from decades of storage. He is not thinking about corporate history. He is thinking about whether the landing gear will align properly and how long the paint will need to dry before he can mask it. He builds it anyway, he always has.